Hello everyone, and welcome to the next topic in our Agribusiness in Focus Expert Insights from BDO series. Today we're going to be talking about the Research and Development Tax Incentive. My name's Jodie Knowlton and I'm in our Business Services team here at BDO, and I'm also joined with Dan Splatt, who is a manager in our Research and Development Tax Incentive team. So to start with today, Dan, if you could run through, tell us a little bit about what the R&D tax incentive is all about.
Yeah, no worries at all, Jodie. So essentially the R&D tax incentive has been brought in to incentivise companies to undertake activities they might not otherwise undertake due to uncertain results or uncertain outcomes as to those activities.
So what benefit can we get from if companies and businesses out there, especially in the agri space, are undertaking activities that they don't know what the outcome is before they start it? What kind of benefit can they receive from doing that?
So essentially, Jodie, the benefit's determined by your aggregate turnover. So companies with an aggregate turnover of under 20 million can access the 43.5% refundable tax offset. And what that means is that if you spend 100 grand on R&D activities, you can get up to 43.5 grand back as a cash refund. Now, when we talk about the refundable tax offset, we also talk about the net after tax benefit of claiming, and that's essentially the difference between your corporate tax rate, which because you can normally deduct these expenses anyway, and your refundable tax rate of 43.5%. So for a company with a tax rate of 27.5%, the net after tax benefit of claiming would be 16%. And so if you're in tax payable, you get that additional tax offset.
Excellent. And Dan, this refundable amount that you're talking about in there, that really only relates to entities if they've got a turnover of less than 20 million?
That's correct. That's correct, Jodie. So if your turnover is over $20 million, then you're eligible for the 38.5% non-refundable tax offset. So where you've got a corporate tax rate of 30%, your net after tax benefit of claiming is 8.5%. And also interestingly, so there's been some proposed legislation which does affect the non-refundable claimants. So they've introduced an intensity premium. So from 1 July 2021, if you're spending more than 2% of your total company expenditure on R&D, you're actually eligible for a 16.5% premium on anything above that 2% intensity. And under that, it's still that 8.5% net after tax benefit. Now, for the current financial year, similar to the refundable tax offset, the net after tax benefit is really the difference between your corporate tax rate and the non-refundable offset rate of 38.5%. So, for example, for the 2020 financial year, with a corporate tax rate of 27.5%, the net after tax benefit of claiming is 11%. And we can include a table with this presentation which shows all those benefits that you can get from the R&D tax incentive.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. That's really interesting, and you've got to be really careful about where you're sitting in there, what year you're looking at to see what the benefit is going to be to your business in there. The aggregated turnover side of things is really tricky. You've got to make sure that you bring in all your connected entities and affiliated entities when you're looking at that, not just the entity that's claiming the R&D activity. So Dan, what are some of the other eligible criteria that we need to make sure we tick off on to be eligible for the R&D tax incentive?
So the big one there is that you need to be an incorporated entity, so no trust, which is quite common with agribusinesses. And you also need to incur at least $20,000 on R&D activities in the income year, unless you're contracting out to a research service provider.
When you're saying about the incorporated entity in there, if someone has a corporate trustee of a trust, does that is that make it eligible or not?
No, it's generally not eligible unless there's a trading entity that they're the trustee for.
Yep. So it's only if it's a company operating in its own right that has that activities going through it that is eligible to claim this R&D tax incentive.
Yeah, that's right. And it's something we see quite often actually in the agribusiness sector, trusts being set up and then unfortunately claimed through them.
Yeah, a lot of the clients that I deal with in the agribusiness sector, especially more the mum and dad kind of ones, don't necessarily have a company structure in there. So I think that's a big point that to be aware of in there, that there's some planning that we can do around that structuring of the activities that will go on within this. Thanks for that, Dan. So is there any other specific kind of criteria that we need to be thinking of when we're looking through what activities we're doing?
Yeah, so essentially there's two types of R&D activities we can look to claim. You need at least one, what we call core R&D activity to start with. So that's essentially any experimental activity that you're undertaking to overcome technical uncertainty, which is essentially determined by whether you could know or determine the outcome in advance of undertaking that experimental activity, and you generate new knowledge, which can be in the form of new or improved products, processes, devices, services. So a common example of the types of core R&D activities we can claim under the R&D tax incentive is if you're experimenting with a different or new feed regime to try and improve the weight gain in cattle or reduce your methane emissions. So in that instance, your technical uncertainty would be if you don't know whether you're going to be able to achieve those weight gain metrics, and that you need to undertake an experimental process to overcome that technical uncertainty and generate that new knowledge, which would be in the form of a new feeding regime.
So you said that there was two kind of elements to this. So what's the other element to it once you've worked out the core activities?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jodie. So the other types of activities we can claim are supporting R&D activities, where you've got an eligible core R&D activity. And so those are the non-experimental activities which may be directly related to a core activity or undertaken for the dominant purpose of supporting those core R&D activities. So if we take that example I just talked through with the feed regime, if the company was doing the background research prior to that experimentation on the available feeding regimes and their impact on weight, that would be a supporting activity. Similarly, things like your project administration and preparation for those experiments.
Thanks, Dan. Now that we've ran through all the eligible criteria in there, what kind of expenses can we claim under the R&D tax incentive?
Yeah, so there's a number of different types of expenditure we can claim. The general gist is that they need to be incurred on those activities which we would register. So you can claim things like R&D salary expenditure, so the wages of the employees that have spent time on their R&D activities for both your core and supporting activities. You can also claim the costs of any external contractors that you enlist to undertake those R&D activities and other direct costs such as your travel, consumables, licensing fees, etc. And you can also claim the depreciation for the time that assets are used in your R&D activities. And also a portion of overhead, so things like rent, electricity, etc.
You mentioned depreciation in there. How does that interact with the instant asset write-off?
Yeah, so unfortunately with the small business write-off, we can't actually claim any of that write-off for the R&D tax incentive, but there are some quirks around the new COVID measures that have been introduced in certain circumstances where we can actually claim some of that write-off.
So just to clarify in there, if you're a small business entity and you've got turnover of less than $10 million, and then you won't be eligible to claim anything that you've written off under the instant asset write-off because they've been pooled to be required to be eligible to claim that. But if you're there above that $10 million turnover threshold in there, then are they eligible to claim the instant asset write-off?
Yeah, potentially. If it's not the small business pool because it's through a different section, and if the first use is in R&D activities, then you can claim the asset write-off.
So now that we've worked through what the criteria is, what we can and can't claim within there, what's the process that's undertaken to actually get some of this cash back?
So the process generally starts with us meeting with the technical personnel and getting details on each of the core and supporting activities undertaken during the year. And that is then registered in an R&D application form, which is lodged with the AusIndustry. So that needs to be done within 10 months of the financial year end, generally, except in years affected by pandemics. So, for example, 30 June year end companies would need to lodge by 30 April the following year. Once we've done that, we then get an IR number in a notice of registration, and that number is then incorporated into the expenditure calculations and an R&D tax incentive schedule, which is provided to tax agents such as yourself to incorporate into tax returns.
So that's a really good point. So if some of this activity has been done in, say, the 2020 year, and people out there have already lodged their 2020 tax return, are you saying that they've got then till April next year to actually register that activity with Oz Industry and possibly then amend their previous tax return?
Correct. So you have that 10 months to register the activities, and then you've got the normal amendment period to be able to amend your tax return and incorporate that R&D tax incentive schedule.
Thanks everyone for listening. That's been a short snippet in relation to the R&D tax incentives. If you've got any questions in there, feel free to reach out to myself or to Dan Splatt, and we'll be happy to answer any of your questions.